Haireddin Barbarossa, a name that reeked of blood, salt, and sulfur. A name whispered with dread in Europe, yet spoken with reverence, almost prayer, in the Ottoman Empire. Yet here lies a paradox rarely voiced in academic circles. This sea devil, this architect of countless raids and destruction, was simultaneously a guardian of the faithful. His true name was Hızır. His honorific title, bestowed by the Sultan himself, was Hayreddin, literally meaning goodness of the faith, or guardian of the believers. Consider the absurdity, the cynical irony of history. A man whose ships left behind ash and lamentations, whose boarding parties knew no mercy, who was, in essence, the chief terrorist of the Mediterranean in his era, was simultaneously an official, state-sanctioned figure. Not merely a pirate, but a state-sponsored corsair. He was the architect not only of naval victories, but also of acts that contemporaries would label genocide, slaughtering entire settlements, only to then, with the same dispassionate efficiency, rescue thousands of Muslims and Jews from the Inquisition, transporting them to the lands of the Ottoman Empire. He was an executioner and a savior, all in one. A monster and a hero, depending on which side of the Mediterranean you viewed him from. This is more than a biography. It's an anatomy of power in its most sordid manifestations, where violence becomes a tool of state building and ruthlessness a virtue. How is such a personality forged? How does one become both a symbol of ruthless expansion and a pillar of support for those desperately seeking refuge? What specific events forged this steel blade, honed on the edge of faith and absolute cruelty? This is a story not just of conquests, but of transformation, of a choice made on the brink of an abyss, where death and legacy intertwined into a tight knot. We are accustomed to seeing Hayreddin Barbarossa as the embodiment of naval terror, the architect of raids, destruction, and acts that modern ethics would unhesitatingly label as genocide. He was a monster to some and a savior to others, an executioner, and simultaneously the hand that snatched thousands of Muslims and Jews from the clutches of the Inquisition, granting them new life under the Ottoman crescent. But what, or more precisely, who, forged this paradoxical, multifaceted personality? How does an ordinary man become not merely a pirate, but a state-sponsored corsair, whose actions serve as a tool of power and state-building? The answer lies not so much in geography as in psychology, in the brutal anatomy of a soul forged at the crossroads of worlds, and in the crucible of survival. Imagine a child, Hızır, whose very origins defied the era. His father was a renegade Greek who converted to Islam, his mother a Turk. This was not merely a mixing of bloodlines, it was a clash of cultures, religions, and worldviews, woven directly into his DNA. He was both a part of and an outsider to each of these worlds, allowing him to view them all with a detached, almost cynical clarity. This provided him with a unique perspective, the ability to understand and exploit the contradictions, weaknesses, and fears of both sides, the Christian West and the Islamic East. This wasn't just a home, it was a laboratory for forging a predator capable of adapting to any environment. And this environment, the Mediterranean of the 15th, 16th centuries, was not just cruel, it was merciless. The sea was not a route for trade or leisure. It was a battlefield that knew neither honor nor rules. Every wave brought a threat, every horizon could turn into a pirate raid or an attack by an enemy fleet, sanctioned by some civilized monarch. There was no room for sentiment. Survival demanded ruthlessness, cunning, and a willingness to step over others. Here, states acted like gangs, and gangs, with enough power, became states. In this cauldron of blood, salt, and gunpowder, Hızır's character was forged, tough, pragmatic, devoid of illusions. He didn't learn morality, he learned survival. But there was one turning point, one point of no return, that transformed the promising, yet still junior, brother into the very sea devil, whose name still sends shivers down spines, the death of Aruj. His elder brother, the true Barbarossa, Redbeard, a legend who instilled terror in European hearts even during his lifetime, fell in battle against the Spanish. This was not merely the passing of a loved one, it was the collapse of a symbol, yet simultaneously the passing of the torch. The moment Hızır accepted not only the legacy, but also the title Barbarossa, he ceased to be merely Hızır. He became the embodiment of vengeance, fury, and defiance associated with his brother's name. It was more than just a name. It was a vow. A vow not only to avenge but to surpass, expand, and deepen the empire of fear that Aruj had begun. This was a moment of psychological transformation. Shedding his former self, Hızır donned the mantle of a monster, which he himself perfected. From then on, he was not merely a pirate. He was a symbol of unstoppable force, born from chaos and fueled by fear. And this newfound, ruthless will, tempered by hardship and bathed in blood, would soon manifest itself not only in naval battles, but also in far grander games where entire kingdoms and the fates of nations hung in the balance. The ashes of Aruj, his elder brother, had not yet cooled on the decks, but Hızır, having assumed his name and legacy, already viewed the horizon not as a boundary, but as an open wound through which poison could be injected or blood drained. The Mediterranean, that cradle of civilizations and simultaneously its slaughterhouse, demanded a new master, or at least a new butcher. And Hızır, now Barbarossa, Redbeard, understood perfectly that to become not merely a pirate, but a state-sponsored corsair, he needed not only luck and ruthlessness, but also the seal of legitimacy, the shield and sword of an empire. It was then, in 1518, after Oruj's death and the loss of Tlemcen, when his position in Algiers seemed precarious, that Hızır made a move that changed not only his fate, but the entire balance of power in the Mediterranean. He turned to the Ottoman Sultan Selim I, not with a plea for help, but with an offer that was both audacious and brilliant. He offered Algiers, that strategic foothold on the North African coast, as a vassal state. In return, he requested protection, resources, and, most importantly, official recognition. This was not an act of desperation, but a cold calculation. Barbarossa understood that without a powerful patron, his pirate principality would eventually be crushed by the combined might of the Christian powers. He offered the Sultan the key to the Western Mediterranean, and himself, invulnerability. The Sultan, and after him his successor, Suleiman the Magnificent, saw in this pirate not merely a successful corsair, but a strategic resource of incredible value. Hızır received a fleet, artillery, janissaries, and most importantly, the title of Beylerbey of Algiers and Kapudan Pasha, commander-in-chief of the entire Ottoman fleet. From then on, he was not merely a pirate, but a state-sponsored corsair, goodness of the faith, as the Sultan himself named him, Khayr al-Din. His raids were now not merely plunder, but part of Ottoman foreign policy, acts of war approved by the Caliph himself. This was the moment when private brutality became state doctrine, and personal vengeance, a tool of imperial expansion. Who would have thought that such a subtle political calculation could be born in the mind of a man whose hands were steeped in blood? But recognition alone was not enough. Algiers, having become an Ottoman outpost, remained vulnerable. Right off its coast, like a venomous tooth in a mouth, jutted the Spanish island fortress of Peñón. It was not merely a base, it was a symbol of Spanish control, a constant threat that marked every entry into the harbor. Capturing it seemed impossible. The fortifications were impregnable, the garrison well-armed, and the approaches to the island lethally dangerous. But Khayr al-Din, now Khayr al-Din Barbarossa, was not one to recoil from the impossible. In 1529 he began a siege, drawing all his forces. Days dragged into weeks, the Spanish held firm. And then, as if by the will of the sea devil himself, a storm erupted. Not just a tempest, but a veritable biblical flood that shattered the Spanish ships at anchor and damaged parts of Peñón's fortifications. This was the twist that could either break or elevate him. Barbarossa, whose name was already whispered with dread across the Mediterranean, immediately exploited this chaos. He threw his forces into the assault, catching the Spanish off guard. The fortress fell. But Khayr al-Din did not stop there. He ordered hundreds, thousands of captured slaves, Christians of course, to begin constructing a mole. Stone by stone, chain by chain, under the scorching sun and the whips of overseers, they connected the island to the mainland, transforming an open bay into a sheltered harbor, an impregnable fortress, the heart of his pirate kingdom. This was more than mere construction. It was an assertion of power, carved in stone and mixed with blood and sweat. a symbol that from then on, Algiers was not just a haven for corsairs, but a full-fledged naval base from which terror emanated to all Christian shores. What is it like to be someone who transforms a natural disaster into a strategic advantage, and human lives into building material for one's empire? This was the peak of his power, a sense of impunity. After Peñón, Khayr al-Din seemed capable of anything. His fleet, now Ottoman, became the scourge of the Mediterranean. But the true jewel, the tantalizing prize that beckoned him and promised even greater glory, was Tunis. A wealthy port state, controlling key trade routes. Tunis was under the rule of the Hafsid dynasty, but internal intrigues and a struggle for the throne were simmering there, which Khayr al-Din skillfully exploited. He didn't just attack, he sowed discord, bribed, promised, manipulated. In 1534, taking advantage of another internal conflict, he suddenly landed in Tunis. This was not merely a naval landing, but a masterfully planned operation combining military might with political treachery. The city plunged into chaos. Khayr al-Din was not one of those admirals who sit on the flagship, observing the battle from afar. He was in the thick of the action, his red beard flashing among the janissaries and street fights, where every alley could become a grave and every house a fortress. He fought personally. His courage, or if you will, his recklessness, inspired his men. The street fighting was brutal, but the resistance was broken. Tunis fell, and Khayr al-Din Barbarossa, now not just an admiral but a conqueror of an entire kingdom, entered it as a triumphant victor. This was the zenith of his glory. He controlled the western Mediterranean, turning it into a lake of terror for Europeans and a safe haven for the Muslim world. His name became synonymous with invincibility, his ships, harbingers of apocalypse. He was the king of pirates, an admiral of the empire, and it seemed no one could challenge him. He was so confident in his impunity that he could afford any atrocity, any audacious raid, knowing that the full might of the Ottoman Empire stood behind him. But even the most powerful predator is not alone in the jungle. And even the most brilliant strategist does not operate in a vacuum. Behind the scenes of this bloody spectacle, where Barbarossa was merely one of the main actors, far more complex and cynical games were unfolding, with threads reaching not only from Istanbul, but also from Paris, Madrid, Rome, and even from the depths of hell itself. We have already seen how Khayr al-Din Barbarossa, the sea devil, forged his empire from blood and salt, transforming Algiers into an impregnable citadel and Tunis into another trophy. But let us not be naive. No noble brigand in history, no matter how brilliant, achieves such power in a vacuum. Behind every great destroyer and creator always stand far more powerful forces, pulling strings, financing, legitimizing. And Khayr al-Din was no exception. He was merely the tip of the spear in the hands of a far grander player, the Ottoman Empire. Suleiman the Magnificent, this titan of the East, did not simply patronize Barbarossa. He used him. He transformed a pirate into a statesman, a bandit into an admiral of the fleet, capable of challenging all of Europe. For Suleiman, Khayr al-Din was not merely a talented corsair. He was the living embodiment of Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean. He was a tool that allowed him to project power westward, control trade routes, threaten the coasts of Spain and Italy, and most importantly, ensure the safety of Muslim refugees fleeing the Inquisition. Barbarossa, with all his brutality and ruthlessness, was the ideal executor for a policy that recognized no sentiment. He was Kapudan, Pasha, commander-in-chief of the Ottoman fleet, but in essence, he was a state-sponsored terrorist whose actions, however wild they seemed, were sanctioned and directed from Istanbul. This was cynicism of the highest order, calling a pirate an admiral and his plunder legitimate acts of war. But if the Ottoman Empire was an overt patron, history, as always, had another, far more perverse twist in store for us. Imagine the most powerful Christian monarch in Europe, King Francis I of France, forming a secret, and at times overt, alliance with this very sea devil and his Ottoman masters. Why? Because his sworn enemy, Emperor Charles V, controlled too much. Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Naples, Sicily, vast territories in the New World. Charles was a threat to French hegemony. And in this geopolitical game there was no room for morality, only pragmatism. Francis I, the most Christian king, without batting an eye, was willing to cooperate with the infidels and their pirates, merely to weaken his Catholic rival. It was a dirty, underhanded game where dynastic interests outweighed any religious or ethical considerations. French ports sometimes became havens for Ottoman galleys, French agents shared intelligence, and at times even French ships joined Barbarossa's raids, creating an inconceivable, almost surreal alliance. This was the true face of 16th-century European diplomacy. Shameless, ruthless, utterly amoral. And of course, on the other side of this bloody chessboard stood those desperately trying to stop this maritime plague. The chief antagonist, without a doubt, was Emperor Charles V himself, a man whose dominions were Barbarossa's primary target. For him, Khayr al-Din was not just a pirate, but a personal affront, a symbol of the Ottoman threat that undermined his Christian empire. Charles, being a deeply devout Catholic, saw this not merely as war, but as a crusade against Islamic expansion. Beside him was his loyal and equally formidable admiral, Andrea Doria, the Genoese sea wolf, who himself rose from mercenary to admiral of the imperial fleet. Doria was the only one who could match Barbarossa in naval battles. His strategic genius and knowledge of the Mediterranean were comparable. Their confrontation was not just a clash of fleets, but a duel between two titans, two of the greatest naval commanders of the era, each willing to do anything for victory. And finally, there were those caught between a hammer and an anvil. Mulay Hassan, the deposed Hafsid Sultan of Tunis, was one such figure. His fate is the tragedy of a weak ruler, who, in desperation, was willing to surrender his people to the mercy of foreigners, just to regain his lost throne. He sought aid from Charles V, offering him Tunis as a vassal state, in exchange for Barbarossa's expulsion. His betrayal of his own people, his willingness to make a deal with the infidels for personal power. This is further testimony to the rotten, cynical atmosphere in which the politics of that era festered. This complex web of alliances, betrayals, and personal ambitions, where piracy was not just plunder, but an instrument of state power, where religion was used as a smokescreen for political intrigues, was bound to explode sooner or later. And the point of this explosion already loomed on the horizon, promising Tunis a bloody reckoning for the games of great powers. The Mediterranean, 1535. The air was charged with the premonition of something grand, irreversible. Mulay Hassan, the deposed Sultan of Tunis, had sold his soul, his people, his city, in a desperate bid to regain his throne. He had summoned the devil, but the devil did not come alone. Behind Charles V, the emperor whose domains stretched from the New World to Vienna, stood not just a fleet, but a crusade. And this was no metaphor. Thousands of knights, soldiers, and cutthroats, lusting for plunder, marched on Tunis under the banners of Christianity to wrest it from the grasp of Khayr al-Din Barbarossa, this sea devil who had become an Ottoman governor. It was a clash of titans, an epic struggle that was to decide the fate of the Mediterranean for decades to come. Charles V's fleet, over 400 ships, nearly 30,000 men, wasn't just sailing. It sailed, carrying on its decks the promise of retribution, redemption, and, of course, untold riches. Could Barbarossa, with his limited forces, oppose anything against this armada? He was not foolish. He understood that Tunis was not Algiers. Here were not his loyal corsairs, his raid-hardened cutthroats. Here were Hafsid subjects, whose loyalty was as shifting as desert sand. And he knew that the French King Francis I, his situational ally, whose intrigues with the Ottomans were legendary, would not lift a finger to save him in this particular slaughter. The French needed a constant headache for Charles, but not at the cost of direct involvement in open naval warfare. They preferred Barbarossa to remain their wild card, rather than a burden to be rescued. This is the cynicism of high politics. You are either useful, or you are expendable. Barbarossa, facing superior forces, made a decision that might have seemed insane, but was dictated by his pragmatic, ruthless nature. He fortified La Goletta, a key fortress defending the entrance to the Bay of Tunis. He mined it, preparing to blow it up if the enemy broke through. He gathered his most valuable treasures, his elite, and prepared a path for retreat. But what about Tunis? The city he had captured by exploiting internal strife, and which was now destined to become a battlefield? The answer was simple. use it as a shield, and then, if necessary, as an inferno. The siege of La Goleta was brutal. Imperial forces, led by Charles V in person, stormed the fortress, disregarding casualties. Barbarossa and his garrison fought desperately, but the forces were too unequal. When it became clear that its fall was inevitable, Khayr al-Din gave the order to blow up the citadel. He wanted to deny Charles V his prize, to turn victory into a Pyrrhic one. But as often happens, the Sea Devil's plans went awry. The explosion was not powerful enough, or perhaps it was detonated too late. La Goleta fell. And then, true hell began. Imperial forces advanced on Tunis. But what followed was not merely the capture of a city. It was a reckoning. A reckoning for Barbarossa's ambitions, for Mulay Hassan's cynicism, for Charles V's imperial claims. And the price was paid not by kings or admirals, but by the ordinary people of Tunis. The city, which had recently been a thriving center of trade, was transformed into a slaughterhouse. Historians still debate the exact figures, but one thing is undeniable. The massacre was horrific. Tens of thousands of people, men, women, children, were killed. Killed with the ruthless efficiency characteristic of soldiers promised plunder and free rein. The streets of Tunis ran with blood. Houses were plundered. Holy sites desecrated. The violence was total, all-encompassing. Christian soldiers seeking revenge for centuries of pirate raids, for enslaved compatriots, for desecrated faith, unleashed their full fury upon the city. Or perhaps they simply used a convenient pretext to unleash their basest instincts. For what is war, if not state-sanctioned permission for murder and plunder? By some estimates, up to 70,000 people perished. 70,000 lives, wiped from the face of the earth in a matter of days. This is not just a statistic. These are fathers, mothers, children, whose stories ended by sword, by fire, or in slavery. Those who survived were either sold into Europe's slave markets or remained in the ruins, mourning their dead. Tunis was not merely captured, it was dissected. Torn apart, its flesh and blood scattered through the streets, its soul scorched. And Barbarossa? He was not one to stay until the end when all was lost. He was a pragmatist. When it became clear that resistance was futile, and the Tunisians, seeing the approaching imperial army, rose up within the city, opening the gates to Charles V. Khayr al-Din did not heroically perish. He fled, with part of his fleet, with his most valuable treasures, with tens of thousands of slaves he had managed to capture before the massacre began. Yes, even in such a situation, he did not forget his assets. He left, abandoning the city to the mercy of the victor. The Tunisians, who had betrayed him to save their lives, found not freedom, but an even crueler master. They chose between plague and cholera, and got both at once. This was a crushing victory for Charles V, a triumph of Christianity over the Muslim devil. Mulay Hassan was restored to the throne, but as a vassal of the emperor, with humiliating terms and an occupying garrison. Tunis was devastated, its economy undermined, its spirit broken. But was this the end of the story for Khayr al-Din Barbarossa? Or did this defeat, this horrifying bloodbath, merely harden him, making him an even more dangerous and unpredictable player on the great chessboard of the Mediterranean? The loss of Tunis was just one act in this endless drama, a drama where every player, every king, every admiral, every pirate pursued their own goals, stopping at nothing, and where the price was always measured in the blood and suffering of those who stood in their way. And this is just one of the lessons we have yet to learn from this anatomy of a sea devil. How can we distill the essence of Khayr al-Din Barbarossa's life? Not merely the audacious raids, strategic conquests, and tactical genius that stained the Mediterranean red, but also the chilling, undeniable truth, buried beneath layers of legends, myths, and self-serving propaganda. Because what we truly see in the Ottoman Empire's Sea Devil is not merely a historical anomaly, it is a meticulously crafted blueprint. A grotesque, yet frighteningly functional model of how power truly operates on the grandest, most merciless stage. History, my friends, is rarely a clear dichotomy of good versus evil, pure light against absolute darkness. More often, it is a brutal, high-stakes chess game played on a global scale, where pawns are entire nations, and kings are colossal empires, and morality is a fleeting, ephemeral luxury that no one, especially those wielding true power, can afford. Barbarossa was not merely a pirate in the romanticized sense. He was an instrument of statecraft. A blunt, blood-soaked weapon, wielded with surgical precision by the sublime Porte, transforming the chaotic, often desperate art of raiding into a sophisticated, state-sponsored strategy of expansion and dominance. The Ottomans didn't just tolerate his piracy, they legitimized it, elevated it, seamlessly integrated it into their grand imperial design. He was the ideal privateer, but his private ventures always, unequivocally, served a larger, infinitely more cynical geopolitical agenda. Consider this. A man born of waves and sword, a formidable corsair granted supreme naval command, endowed with the vast resources of an empire to wage war, not merely for personal gain, but for the very soul of the Mediterranean, for control of vital trade routes, for the projection of unassailable power, and for the destabilization of every rival. This wasn't about gold doubloons and rum-soaked dreams. This was about empire. And who were his great adversaries in this bloody dance? Were they truly noble crusaders, paragons of virtue? Or merely competing empires, equally steeped in ambition, hypocrisy, and the blood of countless innocents? Recall Charles V, the self-proclaimed defender of Christianity, leading his magnificent crusade on Tunis, only to preside over a massacre that eclipsed even Barbarossa's most brutal raids. 70,000 souls, by some estimates, slaughtered or condemned to the horrors of slavery, not by the legendary devil pirate, but by the Holy Roman Emperor. Tell me, where exactly does heroism end and barbarism begin? Is it defined by the flag you march under or the God you serve? Or is it simply a matter of who ultimately wins, who survives to write the history, and whose propaganda machine proves more effective in shaping collective memory? Barbarossa, known as the benefactor of faith, to thousands of desperate Muslims and Jews whom he rescued from the Spanish Inquisition, transporting them to the relative safety of Ottoman lands. Simultaneously, he was the scourge of Europe, an unspeakable monster who enslaved Christian populations and ravaged coastal cities. Both narratives, in their distorted forms, are undeniably true. Both are horrifying, and both, crucially, were convenient for those who crafted them. Now, let's bring this uncomfortable, blood-soaked truth, screaming out, into our present. Do you, even for a second, naively believe that the game has fundamentally changed? Look around. The proxies fighting today's shadow wars are not swashbuckling corsairs with cutlasses, but they are just as much instruments of state power, often operating in gray zones, their actions vehemently denied even as they serve precise strategic objectives. Nations arm freedom fighters, who from another perspective are unequivocally terrorists. It's the same cold, calculating pursuit of power, merely clad in new, digital attire. The same fluid, opportunistic alliances persist, where yesterday's mortal enemy is today's indispensable strategic partner and tomorrow's inevitable target. Recall Francis I, the Christian king of France, openly forging an unholy alliance with the infidel Ottomans and their infamous pirate admiral against his fellow Christian monarch, Charles V. This wasn't merely pragmatism. It was pure, raw, icy geopolitical ruthlessness, a willingness to sacrifice any semblance of morality for strategic advantage. And what about information warfare? The fake news of the 16th century was simply the prevailing narrative, carefully constructed and ruthlessly imposed by the victor. Barbarossa was an unholy monster to Europeans, a revered hero to the Ottomans. Charles V was a glorious liberator to his subjects, a genocidal butcher to the Tunisians. Each side paints its heroes in shining, untarnished armor, and its villains with horns, cloven hooves, and pitchforks. We are still, centuries later, caught in this perpetual maelstrom of manufactured consent, deliberate obfuscation, and weaponized narratives. Truth itself becomes the first and most enduring casualty, replaced by any convenient fiction that best serves the powerful. The very idea of an objective, impartial historical account dissolves under the crushing weight of competing interests, leaving behind only fragments of what actually transpired. So when we strip away the contrived romance, the thrilling adventures, the black flags flapping in the wind, and the roar of cannons echoing across the seas, what indelible lesson does Khayr al-Din Barbarossa, this greatest state pirate, truly teach us? Is it that justice is merely a word, whispered then silenced by the powerful. That morality is no more than a fragile cloak, donned and discarded at will, depending on the prevailing winds of power. That humanity, despite its lofty self-congratulatory pronouncements of progress and enlightenment, remains eternally bound by the same basic, primal instincts for power, control, and survival, regardless of the cost, regardless of the rivers of spilled blood in their pursuit. This man, this sea devil, was undoubtedly a product of his brutal, unforgiving time. But he was also, and perhaps more disturbingly, a harsh, unblinking mirror, reflecting the darkest impulses of statecraft and the chilling, inhuman indifference of power. He forces us, if we dare to truly look, to ask, is the line between hero and villain truly so sharp, so absolute? Or is it merely a cleverly constructed fiction we tell ourselves to sleep soundly at night? And if it is indeed the latter, what does that chilling realization truly say about us, about our own capacity for both monstrosity and salvation, even in this seemingly enlightened age?